Okay, welcome to episode number 2 of the human condition. I should probably recap real quick what we've talked about last time. So we basically opened the 4-dimensional space and we drew it like that. At the bottom we have our timeline, and we said, that basically the human beings human beings live as we would all accept in 4 dimensions, that is 3 spatial dimensions plus time, and that apart from there being time in the sense of it takes time to move an object from A to B, that there's also something called, that we should probably call psychological time, and that refers to the brain, going back in back to memorized events and or anticipating future events. And I think what's essential is that when we do that, we probably pretty much always do that in reference to what we said, the I. What we said is the I. So we remember past events and we anticipate future events in reference to that which we call the I. And what we call the I, or the self, is, when you look at it from a physical perspective, from the perspective of a brain, it's a byproduct of having perceptions. So why is that important? Well, it's important, you'll see in future episodes, in that think about how much importance we give to this side product, if you will, and how much that determines, actions and the way we live and the way we build societies and such. So imagine, on the other hand, if there weren't any eyes, or if they weren't so pronounced, we could have a very different society, and we could have a very different world in which we live in. Now that, of course, is a whole other discussion, but I just wanted to point out that something that happens, to us, more or less, because we do have brains, it's noteworthy that which we give so much importance to nowadays is merely a byproduct of cognition. We then also said that, one can choose to spend a lot of psychological time in the past, that is, having memories of past events, or one could spend a lot of psychological time in the future, and neither of which are actually have anything to do with the present, which we said is located here in the middle at T0. And we then said, well, if that is now, and if there's more dimensions than just those 4, then it would make sense that people probably have access, or the human beings could have access to these other dimensions, and they probably would have conscious access to them when they are at T0. That is, when they are not preoccupied with content of consciousness that's past, or content of consciousness that is anticipated. I think we should today talk about how those different dimensions, and how that, so what the importance of those dimensions could be, and or how it could be that information as we know it, or it's even probably wrong to say information, but that there could be some kind of exchange, between these dimensions, and what that could look like. It all seems very difficult because we don't know you know, here we would say that's space-time, right? So that is sort of like the universe that we know is space-time, so space plus time. But what's outside of it? And of course, nobody knows. But we can just speculate, and science does speculate, and modern science or modern physics does speculate that there are way more dimensions than 4 dimensions. And so we should probably go dive into that today a little bit. And when I thought about, well, what could happen, I thought that quantum field theory is a very nice bridge when you think about dimensions. Not so much when you think about macro objects such as brains, you know, but when we go on a more smaller scale, it's probably easier to imagine how there could be communication between the dimensions. So there's this theory that basically, I will actually link a video in the description box to that, because there's a quantum physicist that explains this quite well, I think. But so basically there's this theory that you know, there's a quantum field that is sort of like at the basis of everything, and that field can also be equal to consciousness. So if that, and for now we should probably treat that as a philosophical hypothesis, to say that consciousness is the base of all things, you know. And the image that particular quantum physicist drew was that we can imagine that out of this pure field of consciousness pop up universes just like ginger ale, you know, just like the little bubbles of ginger ale. So some of them remain stable, you know, and they develop. So inside such a bubble, something like this could develop, and others just sort of pop, you know, they don't actually happen. So there's this theory that there's actually multiple universes, you know, and they all sort of stem from that ground of being, and then, you know, enfolded. Yeah, it's really hard to fathom, but enfolded are sort of like these various dimensions. So when I try to wrap my head around that, especially the fact of multidimensionality, I thought to myself, it makes sense that as you go sort of down the rabbit hole into lower and lower dimensions, things would also become more physical, since presumption is that in here we have spatial dimensions, but everything that's sort of like outside of space isn't spatial. So it makes sense to say that this is enfolded in those higher dimensions, if you want. And there's actually a nice concept to how this enfoldment could sort of happen, and that's the hologram theory. You should probably Google that. I will also link that. Let me make a note. Hologram theory and quantum field theory. Okay, I'll provide 2 links to those topics. So if you look at holograms and how they're made, it sort of helps you to imagine how dimensionalities, how different dimensions could work. And now we have to sort of step into quantum physics real quick. Well, at the basic, the basic argument of quantum physics is that the material world, as we seem to know it, isn't made out of little material pieces, but rather possibility waves. That in itself is really hard to understand, but so there's been these, experiments where you could show that photons behave as particles, but they also behave as waves at the same time. And just the fact that somebody's actually watching, in an experiment, so to speak, sort of collapses what was before a wave function into a physical state of a particle. So there has to be an observer, and the fact that there is an observer seems to collapse that wave function. Now, you can't simply, take something that, so if we would all agree, well, that's what happens on the quantum level, it's really hard to say, well, that's also what's happening on a macro level, in our kind of world. So it's almost saying like, well, this seems to be an object, but then in fact, it's a relatively stable system of wave functions that just seems to be stable enough to remain an object, So basically, that's what happens when you try to extrapolate quantum physics to macro objects, and that's where people have problems, and they sort of, defied that theory for a long time. But today, neuroscience implies that at the very basis of our brains, there's neurons, they sort of look like this. I mean, if that's one neuron, and then you have adjacent neurons, and thinking, or just thinking is based on basically, well, not only thinking, but any sort of action that we can take in our bodies are based of neurons exchanging signals. So today, if you look at like this tiny little end bit of one neuron, you see that there could be something like this happening. So there could be waves overlapping each other. So in turn, that means that there is a possibility that matter, such as brains, can be influenced on a quantum level by possible other dimensions. And what does that have to do with holograms? Well, a hologram pretty much is, one way to produce a hologram is you have a sort of, I guess, I'm sure that's not the right way to say it, but sort of like a photographic plate, in which waves and superpositions of waves are engraved, and if you shine a light through it, then an object appears. So obviously, if this is a two-dimensional plate, then the question is, well, how is it possible that out of a two-dimensional plate, a three-dimensional thing can arise? And that is why hologram theory is important to consider when thinking about all of this stuff, because that could actually be the mechanism. So it could very well be that let's draw this differently. Like, it could very well be that there is something like this quantum field, this very basic sort of quantum field that's all pervasive and that's also conscious. And you would probably, if you were to draw it, if you were to draw it sort of three-dimensionally, you would probably draw it something like this, like there's this infinite sea, so to speak, of waves, and where they collide, and where they interfere, things can sort of pop up and remain stable, and therefore sort of pierce through other dimensions. So I guess if we consider all the different dimensions, we could say, well, here at the tip of the iceberg would probably be 4D, you know, like our kind of world, the way we experience it, but then going down or sort of going back into the field, we would go into these higher dimensions, right? That wouldn't actually have to be spatial. Why? Because as you see here in this very simple drawing that refers to hologram theory, you have a two-dimensional object in which information is sort of engraved, you know, and when you shine a light through it, a three-dimensional object appears. So it's very well possible that this is happening. I can't see the time. I guess we already come up to our 20-minute mark. Anyway, I just wanted to sort of give you these basics. I will make sure that I will link scientific information in case I probably misspeak a lot of times. You know, I'm as I said in the very beginning, I'm not a scientist, I'm not a physicist, but I'm just trying to wrap my head around all these concepts. So if we maybe, you know, circle back to where we came from in the beginning. So it seems like human beings are mostly, you know, as macro objects, we are in this four-dimensional sort of space-time. That's the known universe as we know it. We do have what seems to be the choice to either spend a lot of psychological time with past conscious content or with future anticipated content, or thirdly, we can choose to spend time in the now. And when we do, we seem to have access to a lot more dimensions. And as quantum theory suggests, or quantum field theory suggests, and as also modern neuroscience suggests, there's very well the possibility that there can be an exchange somehow between these different dimensions, which in turn would mean that human beings actually are, sorry, trying to draw a person here. So human beings actually are multidimensional, and they are multidimensional beings in that they do seem to have this this apparatus, if you will, that is capable of interpreting information, of actually taking in information from other dimensions and interpreting it, right? And that is a mouthful in itself. So I'm going to leave you with that for today. I hope to inspire you with these videos, and I hope to interest you in scientific information such as hologram theory or quantum field theory. And yeah, I think this is fun. I hope you find that fun too. Okay, see you next time.